tonight, our challenge is to have a look at the value that there is in vintage champagne. So tonight we've got 8 pairs, 16 champagnes, and our concept is to look at the vintage category versus the prestige cuvée category. Typically, the prestige cuvées are 2 to 3 times the price. So we're just sort of laying it out there for you to say, have a look at these, and my idea is the vintage offer fantastic value. So let's see whether we prove that through the night. And then really, the idea of the scoring is to tell us which is your favourite, I guess. So we're scoring in Jancis's own scoring system between 15 and 20. We've removed the ones below 15 because I'm confident there's no faults in the champagnes tonight. That's the scoring system. There is a prize. Whoever gets the most right tonight, we have Laurent-Perrier's new non-vintage cuvée, La Cuvée. So a magnum is the prize to whoever gets the most correct today. And we'll probably exclude certain people in the press. Certain members of the press and trade might be excluded, I think. I'd just like to introduce you to Jancis, who I spent some time with recently doing some research for this tasting, and I'm not going to say anything more than that. And in the last few years, she's guided us through superbly an evening of, I think we'll call it discovery tonight. And Jancis is really the partner we picked because as one of the world's leading wine critics, there's really nobody else who could do this job. So I don't want to say anything more than welcome, Jancis.
Thank you.
And we're now in your hands.
Lovely. Good. Well, thank you very much for organising this. I certainly don't claim to be a champagne expert. We have Susie Barry and Giles there, who are champagne specialists. I'm just going to be an MC to keep the ball rolling. And actually, I know you're saying, there's a prize for who gets the most wines right. But for me, the interesting thing about these blind pairs of comparison will be to see which ones we prefer more than identifying. Sometimes I think I'm right in saying you've chosen current vintages as much as possible, right? So sometimes some houses have such demand for their prestige cuvées that their prestige cuvées may not always be quite ready to enjoy, whereas perhaps the vintage wines will be more ready. And therefore, I don't think, from my point of view, it would be a mistake in that circumstance to prefer the vintage one, even though it costs a lot less than the perhaps slightly unready prestige one. And as throughout my far too long wine writing life, I've always been looking for value. And who knows, perhaps tonight we will find some really relatively well-priced vintage wines. We are utterly, from the point of view of fairness, doing it in alphabetical order by house. So we'll do a little bit of forwards and backwards in terms of vintages. Nick said, I think it'd be a very good idea to go to Champagne and do some tasting in advance. Visited 9 champagne houses in 2 days. And it was a lovely, very well organised trip. The other one, not the 8 that we're tasting today, plus we thought we'd drop in on Krug. And of course, we're not comparing Krug non-vintage vintage and prestige cuvée tonight because they have a very different system of wines that they present to us. The pair of wines that you are about to taste are Bollinger Grande Année 2007, current vintage, I think, and RD 2002. And of course, Bollinger is very different from everybody else. They don't specifically make a prestige cuvée. They choose one of their vintage dated wines to be a late release, as in their recently disgorged RD release. So the RD 2002 is the same wine as the Grande Année 2002 that was released much earlier. I'll give you a few facts and figures about each pair of wines, but the facts and figures, of course, don't give you immediate clues as to which wine is which. Bollinger, of course, is a very, very distinctive house, blessed with a lot of vineyard, 170 hectares, and very Pinot dominated. There's 60 to 80% in all vintage dated cuvées. And all of the wine for vintage is fermented in barrel, which is a distinguishing mark. And they pride themselves on aging on lees the Grande Année for at least 6 to 10 years. And they're one of the few houses, along with Pol Roger, who still do hand riddling. With the exception of Moet, all of the vintage wines are in Magnum, right? Yeah. Because that's kind of Nick's idea of slightly favouring, showing the vintage wines to their absolutely best ability. And the team at Bollinger said that their Grande Année 2007 will definitely be released eventually as an RD wine. I note that at the end of August, I actually preferred the Grande Année 2007 to the RD 2002. It wasn't always the case when we were tasting these pairs that we necessarily preferred the more expensive wine. And this was a particular example of preferring the less expensive from my point of view. I think that's it. Yeah, yeah. If most people have got the two, so we'll have a little time for quiet tasting and reflection.
So Champagne 1 appears to be the RD, according to everyone, which means not many think Champagne 2 is RD, I assume. So there we go. So is that the result?
Surely. We'll be very upset if it's not. Oh, sorry. Yes, surely. Yes. So one is the older wine, which is much. I think this may be one of the easiest pairs, actually. And I think it's the oldest wine. The 02 is the oldest wine we're tasting tonight, isn't it? No? Oh, we've got apart from the next prestige cuvée, the 95 Blanc de Millénaires. This is the oldest wine. So, and I think it does taste drier, older, and I do think in this case it's got that sort of mushroomy. You wouldn't say the first wine was bursting with fruit. It's kind of got lots of age, but not fruit is not its main suit, I would say. Whereas I think the 07 Magnum is a lovely wine, actually, and jolly nice to drink now. The RD was on the lees 11 years, and the Grande Année for 6 years. But actually, this is a different bottling from the one that we tasted in Champagne, because according to my crib here, this particular RD 2002 was disgorged in October 14, not, as I said, the one we tasted was January this year. And the Grande Année 07 in Magnum was disgorged in June 16. So I think, personally, for sheer drinking, we don't know. Are we going to find out which wine people preferred? Is that? Shall we do that?
I neglected my job. So we've got some scores in. People are jumping ahead a little bit. And which you can do. So,
yes.
I think they're almost identical, aren't they?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's inconclusive.
And I think it's a stylistic thing, isn't it? And it's just, do you like that sort of very Bollinger-y, dry sort of almost smoking a pipe type style, or are you looking for a bit more fruit? And do you think that perhaps wine number 2 is not what you expect of Bollinger? It's a little bit too flirtatious and fruity and so forth. So, you know, I think it's not surprising it's equal. Grande Année is 7, and RD is 4, in this our particular pair. So I'm grateful. So perhaps I won't pontificate about what the dosages were and what the disgorgement dates were of the wines we tasted in Champagne, because they may well be very different from what we're actually going to taste tonight. All right. Right. So I think that's very interesting, and I think that vindicates our exercise, that you know, you've got half and half of what people prefer. But if you're looking for pleasure per pound, then perhaps in this particular instance the Grande Année is the better buy, looking at these two figures here.
The pricing of the two is it's about £80 for. It's probably 85 actually for the Grande Année, and the RD would be. Where's any of my team? It's very scarce. The RD would be about 170. 170,
yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. So quite a big difference. Yeah. And that is the pattern through most of what we're tasting.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got a pair. The next two pair is Charles Heidsieck, and so we've got their vintage, which is 2005 in Magnum, versus the Blanc de Millénaires, which is 1995. So we've got a big age difference with these, and we should be able to spot that when we taste them, because the Magnum should be even younger, being in Magnum. So the 10-year spread should have gone to more. So they're the next two that are coming out.
And many of you will know Blanc de Millénaire, that seems to be indestructible and immortal, because it's been hanging around for so long as Charles Heidsieck's prestige cuvée through different ownerships. The new winemaker at the new chef de cave at Charles Heidsieck from the 2015 vintage onwards is Cyril Brun, who is very impressive. Was at Veuve Clicquot before as I think number 2. And he's really sort of sorting the house out and getting the vintage sequences right after sort of some hiccups. And Charles Heidsieck has made some absolutely brilliant wines consistently. Régis Camus, I think, was in charge of Blanc de Millénaire. And he saw that the 1995 vintage was absolutely wonderful for the grape sources that he had. But Charles Heidsieck at the time, the house, was going through a bit of a rough patch. And his managing director said, make sure you don't make too much prestige cuvée in 1995, because we're not sure we can sell it. And Régis Camus completely ignored him because he saw how good the wine was, and actually made 10 times more wine than he was theoretically supposed to, which is why it's been going on and on and on. And his justification apparently was that managing directors, note this, change much more often than chef de cave, and so and he's been vindicated by the quality of this wine, which tastes relatively indestructible. We shall see how it compares with the Bollinger RD 2002 and whether it tastes distinctly much older than that. It's 100% Chardonnay, and we will be told what the precise dosage of what we're tasting is, but what we tasted in August was 12.2 grams per litre, which nowadays looks very, very high, and is a sort of relic, just shows how long ago it was that originally this wine was disgorged. And of course, because one of the major trends in Champagne, as you know, has been to reduce the dosage. It's a pretty magnificent wine that still seems to me, yes, a mature Chardonnay-based champagne, but it's not like one of those older champagnes that's 100% Chardonnay that actually is almost tasting like white Burgundy. It's very, very definitely champagne. We were told that there's very little bottle variation, and that it's been, the quantities are such that there's a new disgorgement every year in the summer. The 2005 is the current vintage, and I think I got the impression from Cyril Brown that if he'd been around when it had been released, he perhaps wouldn't have released it quite as early as it was released, because I think they're already running out of it, and it, to me, didn't show any signs of being at all old, so it was rather a shame that stocks are running low. Dosage, I think, is still relatively high at Charles Heidsieck. We were told what we tasted was nearly 11 grams per litre. And Cyril Brown said that seemed too high to me when I arrived, so I did all sorts of experiments with different dosage levels, and actually I could quite see why it was so high, and although in theory I wanted to reduce it, I can't see any reason to reduce it. It does seem to suit the style of wine. The 2005 is 60% Pinot Noir, 40% Chardonnay, and it was tasting pretty well to me. So let us see. I mean, in theory, 95 and 2005 should have a massive, massive gap between them, particularly with the 2005 in Magnum. So let's see what we think.
So champagne number 3, the first Charles Heidsieck is.
Aha!
Oh dear. So the 95 is slightly everyone's.
But very slightly.
Very slight
Yeah.
majority.
Yeah.
Okay. So number 4 is slightly the other way. There we go. Oh.
Yeah. No. So that's. So most people.
Okay. So a few people didn't do both. Okay. Luckily I've got a statistician on hand.
Only by a small majority did most people think that wine number 4 was the older one, when there was 10 years in it. And the preferences were very, very close. So again, identical. Are you sure the system's working? Because it does look as though everybody, the scores are identical. Let us assume that it is working. I'll give you the bare bones. With the 05 60% Pinot, 40% Chardonnay, dosage 10.8. I think that's pretty similar to what I said. Disgorged summer 2014 on the lees 8 years. That was wine number 3. And the older wine, wine number 4, the Prestige Cuvée, which the majority of people got, but only just, 100% Chardonnay, dosage 12.2, that high dosage, disgorged spring 2014, on the lees 15 years. I must say, I thought they were quite, on the palate, I thought they were quite different. Although on the nose, I thought they were much closer together than I would have expected, considering there's 10 years between them. But 05 is already a mature wine anyway, isn't it? But it's got that kind of flirtatiousness, that kind of liveliness, and less deep and dense than the Millénaires wine number 4. But I think you have to say that the Blanc de Millénaires is amazing for a wine of its age. From a vintage which, as we remember, there was a lot of 95 versus 96 discussion, and initially people thought 96 was going to be the great vintage, and obviously Régis Camus saw that the 95 was going to be the longer lasting, more deep flavoured wine, and he was certainly right. And so they're a very, very nice pair. I think both of them are tasting very, very well. And I should warn you that because these wines it's alphabetical in terms of the name of the house, I think these two first pairs are unusual in how different the vintages are. We are about to have a pair, I believe, that where the vintages are the same, right? Dom Perignon, 2009, tasted alongside the Moët vintage, Grande vintage, 2009. The only vintage wine which is not in Magnum, because I don't think that's available yet. But we thought it would be more interesting to compare absolutely the same vintage of a vintage and a Prestige Cuvée. And there is hardly a Prestige Cuvée more established and famous than Dom Perignon. We had the pleasure of tasting pairs of these wines with Richard Geoffroy, who's responsible Mr. Dom Perignon, and Benoît Gouet, who works and has done a great job on Moet. When I started out writing about wine, it was sort of fashionable to be a bit critical of Moet and say, it's such a massive house and it's all a bit sweet and simple and, not as serious as many other houses. But I must say, I think that Benoît has done a fantastic job with Richard's input as well. And that I think if you were to taste dispassionately, as I'm sure many of you have, Moët has evolved considerably over the last few years. It's got a lot drier and more sophisticated. And am I all right to be talking about these wines yet? Yes? Yeah. And 09's a very interesting vintage anyway. The two winemakers work very, very closely together. And their verdict on 2009 was it was excessive in every direction. And is Dom perhaps too excessive? Did we cross the Rubicon? They would say it was a very sort of luscious, fruit-driven vintage. And so we will see that, presumably, in both wines. I thought, when I tasted them, that I actually gave them both the same score for how they taste now, but thought the Dom was going to get better and better, whereas the Grand Vintage Moët was already accessible, which is what you would perhaps expect. The Moët 09 has the highest proportion of Pinot Noir of any Moët vintage since 1996. they're particularly pleased with Moet 2009. And whereas I think Richard Geoffroy sort of recognises that Dom 2009 was sort of right at the edge of fruitiness and lusciousness that he would accept as a Dom Perignon, and perhaps is not quite yet ready. But we tasted the Grande Vintage 2009 Moet in bottle, well, as you will tonight. So it would be interesting to see it in Magnum, slightly reined back. But I think it'll be this will be a much closer test of prestige versus vintage, because they are both from the same year. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the fact that Dom Perignon seems to be releasing vintages release every vintage?
The public pronouncement on that is that's what we're winemakers, and what winemakers do is make wine, and we're on this planet to do so, and to make the most of the best of every year. We had an interesting tasting, didn't we, of Dom Perignon's every vintage released this decade. The 09 was not yet released. The 05, from memory, looked a bit weak. But most of them were kind of very respectable, actually. Yeah. I suppose it's a bit like Cristal, when you've got the demand, it's rather difficult to deny it.
But I suppose Dom and Cristal have a
huge different.
They're not always drunk by people who necessarily would appreciate it.
Not like us, who would.
I suppose the proof of the pudding is whether the quality of the wine that's released justifies the label, I guess.
Yeah.
And you know what it did.
It on this specific Dom Perignon tasting, I think we thought all but the 05. With the 03 was also different, as 03 is a different vintage. But I think we thought only the 05 was a little disappointing, actually. Let's taste.
So, champagne number 5 is Moët. Maybe. And, okay. So that works. Nice, straightforward. So Moët looks to have the majority for 5, and
and then do we find out which people liked most? Okay. So this was much closer, didn't you think? I mean, very, very much closer. And I suspect that a lot of people, so most people thought that the Champagne 6 was the Dom, and they were right. So wine number 5 was Moet and Chandon 2009. Wine number 6 was Dom Perignon 2009. Are you ready for the detail? Yeah. Moët 2009, 50% Pinot Noir, 36% Chardonnay, 14% Meunier. Dosage 5 grams per litre. Disgorged January this year. On the lees 7 years. Dom Perignon was on the lees same amount of time, but 60% Pinot Noir, 40% Chardonnay. Dosage slightly less, 4 grams per litre. Disgorged spring 2017, and again 7 years on the lees. So this tells us what people liked, and actually people preferred that slightly more people preferred the Moët to the Dom, although quite a lot of people thought that wine number 5 was Dom, which may be a factor there. I thought that the Dom actually tasted sweeter than the Moët vintage, and that may have been a confusing factor. But I think the Dom had a little bit more depth. It was kind of initially sweeter, but tenser. Whereas the Moet was a little bit more advanced. But it's tiny, tiny splitting hairs among these two, isn't it? And you know, when you think, do we have prices here, folks, of Moet versus Dom?
Yeah, Moët would be around £40, and Dom Perignon typically is around 120 at the moment. So again, quite a big difference, and a very close result. For I think the Moët 09 was showing incredibly well. So.
And for current drinking, you know, I think for current drinking, the Moët 09 must be the value. But if you want to put it away for quite a while, then I think the Dom's going to come out. But it's not a steamrollering the vintage at the moment, and perhaps might change. I don't know what your view of vintage Moët is, but you know, perhaps this result might make you think again about Moët vintage, which yeah.
Moët vintage in magnums ages.
Richard Bamfield, my fellow master of wine, assures us that Moët vintage in magnums ages beautifully, and we haven't even had this vintage in magnums. So I must say I also like the new look of the Moët vintage. Although you have a little some connection with Moët, or no, connection with Dom actually. You used to have a connection with Dom, yeah. But Moët vintage, I like that new. The look of the actual year, yeah, I think it looks quite smart, a lot smarter than it used to. So I think that's great. And if they could, I mean, they must make huge quantity. I mean, I know everybody says, oh, Dom Perignon is made in, you know, unthinkable quantities, but Moët vintage must be made in absolutely massive quantities. And yet it showed pretty well. While you're being served with wines 7 and 8, let me tell you we are moving on to Lanson. One of them is Clos Lanson, the debut vintage of Clos Lanson, from a little walled vineyard next to the headquarters of Lanson in Reims. It's 100% Chardonnay. And one block was planted in 1962, another in 1986, after the frosts of 1985. The grapes, before they launched Clos Lanson, used to go into a mixture of vintage, their vintage champagne and even the non-vintage black label. And they launched it to celebrate Philippe Béjot's acquisition of Lanson in 2006. It always ripens very early. When we were there in late August, they were going to pick it the next day. I said it was 100% oak fermented. I think it can, you know, it sometimes shows oak, but we'll see. And then gold label, the other one is a gold label Brut vintage 2005 in Magnum, which I was told, but I will await the bit of paper at the end, was 53% Pinot Noir, 47% Chardonnay. And this is in Magnum, like the rest of our vintage wines. And I think their current vintage in bottles is 08. Is that right? I made a note of that, but 05 in Magnum. So we'll see. Obviously, there's no malolactic is the signature of Lanson, and would have applied to both these wines. But Hervé Danton, the new chef de cave there from the 2013 vintage onwards, is introducing a little bit of malolactic conversion. So the wines may not be quite as austere in youth as they have traditionally been. But that does not apply to these two particular wines, 7 and 8. So let's see what you think.
So wine number 7 is is Clos Lanson, maybe. And I'm assuming that means we've got a majority for the vintage 05. Yeah, there we go. So.
Everybody is absolutely right. The wine number 7 is Clos Lanson 2006 with that, high acidity. And the Lanson 2005 in Magnum is the wine number 8. I got that wrong. I thought up to now it was quite obvious, but I thought there was more depth to the wine number 8. And so I went for the other way round. Clos Lanson 2006, 100% Chardonnay, dosage 3 grams per litre, disgorged December 14, on the lees 7 years, whereas the gold label in Magnum was on lees 9 years, and 49% Chardonnay, 51% Pinot Noir, dosage 8 grams per litre, disgorged November 2015, and on the lees 9 years, as I say. And I thought they, as I say, for me, they were much closer together than any of the pairs so far. Very well done for the room. What about which ones they liked? We have to disregard. So people slightly preferred the 05 vintage, having correctly identified it, which is quite interesting. Because I think, isn't that the first time that people have... No, Dom Moet was slightly preferred to Dom. And again here, the vintage is definitely preferred to the Prestige Cuvée. Although I think I'm right in saying that the difference in price is not quite as marked as with some of the Prestige Cuvées.
No, but the pricing is about 160. The Clos Lanson is 160, and the Lanson gold label is about 60. I think I'm going to need to research these, don't I?
So now we move on to a pair from Laurent-Perrier. And they are Grand Siècle, I'll tell you the vintages in a minute, and the 2007 vintage, which is the current vintage, which is 50-50 Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in Magnum. And we had a really interesting visit at Laurent-Perrier, where the winemaker Michel Fauconnet explained that he was very, very keen to get, as well as the Laurent-Perrier signature of refinement and elegance, wanted the vintage character in the wine too. And I must say, when I tasted this 2007 vintage there, it very strongly reminded me of that sort of tightness of the and elegance of the Grand Siècle that we tasted. We tasted quite a lot of Grand Siècles, which, as you know, are a blend of 3 different vintages chosen to express the kind of Grand Siècle paradigm, if you like, of wine that is ready to drink when it's released, is a blend of ingredients from 3 different complementary vintages, and is actually so delicate that I posed the question, so which food do you drink with this wine? And I was assured that there were various, particularly fish and white meat sort of things that went well with it. I have a slight. I ended up. I mean, I've always admired Laurent-Perrier. I did end up admiring it more than before from the visit, and I think it's got a great team behind it. I do have a slight quibble with Grand Siècle because, as a consumer, you don't know what's in it. The whole ethos is it's this blend of 3 vintages, but they don't tell you which they are. I think, Nick, you asked, didn't you?
Yeah.
And the answer is, this particular one is a blend of 2002, 99 and 97. But there's no way for a consumer to know that. And it would work brilliantly if distribution systems around the world all worked brilliantly. And you knew that when you bought a bottle of Grand Siècle, it was the latest vintage and it was ready to drink, and you did drink it, because it is released when they reckon it's ready to drink. They want you to drink it within 18 months. But I don't believe that distribution systems are ideal. And you do get bottles sitting in warehouses and restaurants sitting on lots that they've bought and things like that. And so personally, I think it is a little bit inconvenient for the modern information-thirsty consumer that you're left in the dark. You're just told, this is Grand Siècle, you will like it. And you should like it. It's a wonderful wine. But as a consumer advocate, I'm looking for a little bit more information. But that's my quibble over. And clearly there will be a great big difference between the age of the two wines that we're about to taste. One being 2007, 100%, 50-50 Chardonnay Pinot Noir, and one being this blend of 02, 99 and 97, which I think was one of the few Grand Siècles we didn't taste when we were there at the end of August. So they should be in the same idiom of Laurent-Perrier wine, but one older and more complex, having been made up of a blend of these three vintages. And we've had other 07s before, so we might see a relationship there. We had the Bollinger 07. So we shall see. Thank you.
Let's see which is which. So Champagne 9. So Champagne 9 is...
most people thought was Grand Siècle.
So 10 is vintage, is it? There we go. Question is it?
Okay. So it's a very, very knowledgeable room here, because wine number 9 was in fact the Grand Siècle, and 10 was the 07 in Magnum. But it was a difficult one, wasn't it? You were constantly kind of weighing up acidity versus complexity, and with the Grand Siècle not having as its stock in trade kind of maturity, really. It's a wine that's there to be fine and racy and all the qualities that you would have in a young wine. So I think brilliantly done for the room having gone that way. Shall we see what people actually liked? So only just did they prefer the Grand Siècle. So we are, we're moving towards a conclusion that actually vintage wine can be a very good value when we're looking at those relative scores. Even though people are by and large identifying which wine is which. So I think this is really, really interesting. I'm kind of feeling as though there's a general election going on here with us. Let's hope the result is better. Oh, well, I won't go there. So the next house is Louis Roederer, whose Jean-Baptiste Le Caillon is a hero of mine. He just seems to be absolutely on the ball as far as so much work in Champagne goes, and is just trying all sorts of good new things and analysing everything. And again, now we are back to having a pair of wines from the same vintage. But one of them is the most expensive champagne, pretty much, Cristal, or
Yeah, 160.
160 pounds, whereas vintage Roederer would be closer to 60. So big price difference, no age difference. Cristal, and of course Roederer, a house that famously owns an enormous amount of vineyards, is in the forefront of conversion to biodynamics. I think the fruit has a certain kind of vibrancy, sometimes kind of wildflower type aspect to it, rather different from the Champagne norm. Le Caillon told us that Cristal is made generally from the same parcels, 45 of them, on pure chalk. And the idea is to capture the purity of chalk with naturally low yields but high ripeness. I think we were told that the 09 had 60% Pinot Noir. I think the fact sheet says 70%, but you get the picture. A majority of Pinot Noir and a bit of Chardonnay. We will find out the exact dosage, but we were told 9 grams per litre at the time. And it's, you know, it's a very special wine that is released sooner, I think, than wine lovers and probably even the house would like. But that's because there's just massive demand for it. Very racy, very elegant, lots and lots of tension. Possibly lighter in texture than the vintage, but we shall see. Vintage 09, always from the same parcels, but more clay, less chalk, and a majority of maybe 70% Pinot Noir. Some of the Pinot Noir fermented in large old oak, and this 09 has been released before the 08, which is not uncommon in Champagne. The 09s are so fruity and round and accessible, and 08 seems to be that the vintage is ending in 8 recently, kind of 08. 98 and 88, they're all a bit, they do seem to be a bit sort of backward and with lots of structure and acidity. So we shall see, and I noted that the 09 vintage seemed to be kind of absolutely bone dry, but rather majestic in structure. So I suspect that these two wines will be quite difficult to tell apart. I think we've got 11, we haven't got 12 yet, is that right? But I think we will need a little bit of time to look to decide which one is which. And it may well be that we think the 09 is lovely now, and Cristal we would put away for a while. But I think we should mark the wines when we're giving them a mark for pleasure, mark them for current pleasure rather than their cellaring potential. So I hope you enjoy them. They should be a couple of lovely wines.
So champagne number 11 is...
Everyone thinks it's the vintage.
So 11's the vintage, and 12 is Cristal. There we go. So, is it? Hold on. Oh, there you are.
Well, I agreed with you, and as ever, you're right. So 11 is the Magnum of 09, and 12 is the Cristal 09. But I think it was the most difficult pair so far, actually, because they were both stunning wines, I thought. And I'm afraid, how are you going to sell Cristal when the vintage is this good? I don't know. No, Cristal has its followers, and I'm sure you've run out of it, so that's okay. But I would say, just run for the vintage 09. It's looking stunning. It's got that lovely, lovely tension to it, and excitement and vivacity and whatever. Interesting to compare these two 09s with the pair from the Moët house, the Dom and the Moët vintage. They seemed different, I think, more tension. So the Roederer vintage 09 in Magnum, 70% Pinot Noir, 30% Chardonnay, dosage 9, quite high. Disgorged in 2016, and it was 6 years on the lees. The Cristal 09 was 60% Pinot Noir, 40% Chardonnay, dosage 8, disgorged also in 16, and also 6 years on the lees. So, there were lots of things in common, and it tasted like it, didn't it? I thought, they were both absolutely stunning wines, and if you're looking for how to spend your pounds, I would say that Roederer 09 is something to head for.
Would there be anything different in the winemaking process between the two?
Well, as I said, it was about terroir, chalk in particular, but winemaking. I think so. I'm sure that Le Caillon would say that. I don't think. Mark, Mr. Roederer, there's no difference really in how the wines are made, is there? Key difference is terroir. Yeah. Next pair from Pol Roger. Obviously, comparison of the vintage with the Cuvée Sir Winston Churchill. And it's 2006 Winston Churchill, which is the current vintage, and 2008 is the current vintage of Pol Roger. We didn't actually taste that in Champagne, but I've tasted a couple of times here, and it's, I think, looking extremely good, as you might expect. I think 60% Pinot, 40% Chardonnay, and they say at Pol, made by Dominique Petit, more refined even than their 2002, which has done terrifically well here. If any of you were at the tasting we did a year ago of, was it all O2s? Was that? All O2s, and mainly prestige cuvées, but Pol O2 was thrown in Magnum, I think, and I think it was something like the second or third favourite against, quote unquote, the Cristals and the Doms and whatever of this world. So Pol Roger 02, a very famous wine, but they think Pol 08 even better. Then Winston Churchill 06 has just been launched, I think. Oh, not yet. We were told it would be launched the end of September. Mainly Pinot Noir, but we've got it tonight. Very intense, great freshness. I wrote in my original tasting notes, impossible to spit, which is a very good note. And not quite as kind of somehow cigar fumed as some previous vintages. Fruit seemed to be in evidence, and a bit of mushrooms as well. So I think with any luck, we're in for another couple of lovely wines here. Shall we taste them? Thirteen is.
Oh, Churchill.
Oh.
Clearly. And then that means the 14 is the vintage. One of them definitely had a lot more acidity, which I would have expected to be the 08. So let's see, Jancis.
So, wine 13, you're all brilliant. Wine 13 was Churchill, 06, and 14 was the 08 in Magnum. I think they're both looking pretty good, don't you? But maybe the 06 just had that extra zest. And again, difficult, you know, the choice is the zest, quality or youth, really. So, do we want, and people actually preferred the 08 in Magnum, even though they guessed, more people guessed that that's what it was. So people were actively preferring the vintage wine, the cheaper wine. Sorry, the less expensive one. Okay, so Winston Churchill 06, probably 70 to 80% Pinot Noir, 20 to 30% Chardonnay, Dosage 9, disgorged November 2016 on the lees 9 years, and Pol 08 in Magnum, 60% Pinot Noir, 40% Chardonnay, Dosage 7, disgorged October 16 and on the lees 8 years. So that was interesting that people were so, you know, the room was pretty certain which one was which there. And finally, we go to Tétinger, whose winemaker, and we're going to scrub, presumably, that the early votes for wine 15. So we've got Comte de Champagne 06, which is the current vintage, 100% Chardonnay, and vintage 09, which we've tasted before from courtesy of Moët and Dom Perignon. And they are apparently already about to move on to 12, which we didn't taste in Champagne, but I tasted in London, which was had a little bit of sweetness to me, so perhaps that might be a clue. So we shall see. And it will be a difference between an all Chardonnay and a blend, and the difference between an older vintage, 06, and that ripe, round, fruity 09 of the vintage. So perhaps we will end on a note which might be easier to discern than some of the pairs that we've had up to now. But I do think up to now that the vintage wines have shown really pretty well, especially when you take into consideration the price differences. So I think all I'd like to say is tonight has not been a total waste of time. Yeah.
You say about the 2008 vintage, which everyone's getting really excited about. You described it as slightly backwards.
Yes. Why? Well, 08 seemed, just such 08s as I've tasted so far seem to be pretty smart. And it wasn't a particularly easy growing season until it settled into the high summer, and August and September just were, you know, what you wanted, and no excess rain and all nice and warm and dry. And I think the must came in at just about the right kind of balance. And that's, you know, the Champenois nowadays are feeling a little tense about their acid levels, and they were a little bit low, for instance, in 09, but in 08 they were happy with them. And we are conveniently moving on to a house that sees that perhaps this country has something to offer, having rather publicly invested in a Kent vineyard, and is said not to be the only famous champagne house to be investing in British soil. Many years after the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror said that they were going to, but that's by the by. So we shall see. But I think we can be proud of the quality of English sparkling wine. That's going to be your next one, Nick. It's going to be blind. Champagne versus English. I don't know.
I just wanted to share the results quickly of who's scoring really well. So we've still got one person with all of them right, and then a bunch of you with just 2 wrong. So the pressure's all on. For me, it's easier if the person that's winning stays winning, but let's see.
Mainly
So 15 is a passenger, 09.
Yeah.
So that means 16 is comps.
I think the room has been right, hasn't it, in every single case. And the 16 was the Comte, 06. The 09 in Magnum was 50% of each of Pinot Noir Chardonnay. Dosage 9 grams per litre, disgorged May 2016. Only 4 years on these. And Comte, 06, obviously 100% Chardonnay. Dosage again 9 grams per litre, disgorged March 2015, and 9 years on the leagues. So the favourite wine of the room was the Cristal, and then the Comte, which did very well in another tasting here, didn't it? Of the non-prestiges, the Pall 08 did really well, and Roederer 09 did really well. Is it, I don't know, do people get a bit more generous with their points as the time? Maybe, of the prestige cuvées, perhaps the Clos Lanson did least well. But then it was the first vintage, and who knows what they will do, because they're in a sort of state of flux. There we go. So Roederer 09 did brilliantly well for a non-prestige cuvée, as did Pol. Bollinger 07 did pretty well. And this, look at this, they're all the same score. Laurent-Perrier 07 also did very well. If one were to do this in 5 years' time, Lanson to be moving up the ranks. Dom Perignon 09, the Moët and the Dom Perignons maybe didn't do that well, but it was quite early on. So, no, I think definitely worth doing, because it really showed that some of the vintage wines showed very, very well.
What I wanted to do tonight was just kind of put out there the vintage champagnes are potentially really good value. So that was my sort of look into this, and I think what we've shown is some of the vintages have shown incredibly well. And I don't think any of them has really disgraced themselves at all, and this is always the issue. So just because they've come bottom isn't really that bad. But it does kind of give us a little bit of insight into some of the vintages that are showing incredibly well. So 08s and 09s are certainly wowing everybody at the moment. So I think what we set out to achieve has kind of given us some pretty good results, actually. So it's, as I said, right at the beginning, you can spend £60, £70 on the vintage champagnes. And the prestige cuvées are generally 130 to 170. So what I wanted to try and show is that they don't disgrace themselves. And actually, I think a few of them have given the prestige cuvées a bit of a run for their money. I think you've done brilliantly, to be honest. So we're going to send you all one.
Could we ask
which of, because you've got only one pair wrong, which was the one you got wrong?
I think it was the first one.
First one.
Crystal.
And because they were both so good, weren't they? Yeah. And which was the one you got wrong? No, I don't want to. I think you've done brilliantly. Because, yeah, really, really well.
Well, tonight wouldn't have been tonight without all of you, so thank you very much for coming along tonight. And it also wouldn't have been tonight without having been guided, so...
Well, you just need someone to get it wrong.
And because I nearly always forget doing these things, I'm not going to forget this year. Chris, the team who have managed to pour us 16 champagnes and keep up with the raising of the hands and the eyebrows, I think have done brilliantly. So we should have a big thank you to the team at £67. So, thank you very much, because I've been behind the scenes and it's incredibly cramped. And you just brought out 56 times 16, whoever's good at maths. So thank you, you have done a brilliant job. And I'm going to just say, in a year's time, we may have another brilliant challenge. I haven't yet got it in my head, so feel free to talk to me about it. And I hope, Jancis, it's a brilliant enough idea for you to want to engage with it. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy anything that's left. Good night.